Hi everyone, what a great way to start off this discussion. Of course, Justine laid the foundations of an incredible topic, of course, around responsible innovation. And recently we heard the Premier remind us that about 100 years ago, the Eka showgrounds were converted to accommodate the pandemic of the day, which of course was the Spanish influenza. And it's hard to believe that a century later, in the middle of COVID, we were contemplating the same space for a similar use. 2020 will not be the year of Dagwood dogs and fairy floss and circus clowns. It's the year of face masks, hand sanitizers and surgical gloves. Supply chains for these must-have items have certainly been tested and continuously be tested on a global market, which prompts me to ask, are we really at a 4IR tipping point? Now, to understand the fourth industrial revolution, it makes sense to learn from the first industrial revolution. The OG, if you like to call it. The Industrial Revolution was a tipping point. It was huge. For many thousands of years before it, economic growth was practically negligible, generally tracking with population growth. Farmers grew a little bit of food and blacksmiths made a few tools, but people from the early agrarian societies of Egypt and China and India would have recognized the world of the 17th century Europe. And then, of course, when steam power came along and industrial machinery came along in the 18th century, the economic activity absolutely took off. And the growth that happened in just a couple of hundred years was vastly different to the scale than anything else that had happened before. And maybe we're at a similar tipping point, referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, fueled by the mother of all inventions, and that is necessity. All that has happened in the past may appear minor compared to the productivity and the profitability potential of the future, even in the midst of this crisis. Industrial leaders, as well as defence workers alike, they met and they surpassed all challenges of war by designing and producing materials critical to the war effect. And now we have our borders closed. So in the past few months, we've been watching our own personal freedoms of movement dwindle in the interest of a common good. And it's hard to believe that only a few short weeks ago, the public gatherings meant two people alone in an open space. With such serious impact on the pace and scale of COVID-19 and this emergency that was among us and is still among us, we needed to think about our medical supply chains and how fragile in the best of times. COVID has tested its strength, and our ability to overcome this virus must not forsake the deep strategic thinking and ideas with our ability to innovate with different working solutions. Fit for the problems and timely in the market. I remember right in the midst of the crisis, the chief scientist said it so very well. The ideas will be at the forefront and we need to be a challenge-led innovation state. We need solutions, not ideas at this point in time. And the need for certain medical devices and personal protective equipment is outpacing the supply chain for healthcare organisations around the world because of the high demand and interruption to that global supply chain. Now, beyond hospitals and health services, society needed to seek out alternative solutions, which of course is where responsible innovation comes to effect. 3D printing was one of those arms that stood up in the fight for COVID. Now, entrepreneurs, of course, were seeking out a way to develop innovative diagnostics, therapeutics and medical devices so that we could treat any patient that came across our door. But one of the big call outs at this time in responsible innovation, particularly with those, was to caution innovators, particularly with 3D printing devices and accessories, that we need to prepare and certify before you just print and promote, especially as it comes to PPE. Protective clothing and gowns and gloves and face masks were all in need across the world. And 3D printed PPE may involve a large physical barrier for entry into that market, but we need to ensure that we can comply with Australian standards, and so that the filtration systems around those machines link up with the FDA, as well as with the N96 respirators. And as we started to think and engage with entrepreneurs across Queensland that were trialling many devices, it was important to keep at the very forefront of our minds the importance around responsible innovation. Innovation in health and healthcare services has been a strength for Queensland for many years. And our office, both the Chief Scientist and the Chief Innovator, is working closely with all levels of government and industry and innovators and entrepreneurs as a broad response. And as I started to really engage across the ecosystem, particularly with corporates, it made me completely aware that the recovery of COVID, as we start to plan now, is going to be very different as we all re-enter into this new normal. Despite what experts might tell us, I think the recovery is not going to be V-shaped or Y-shaped or W-shaped or L-shaped, or nor is it going to be just a slow tick, an uptick. There's a third dimension and Z-axis that is running, which tells us about the structure of the economy. As we start to rethink this new normal, there's an entirely new line of digital innovation that has occurred. The CEO of Microsoft said it very well, that there are 2 years of digital transformation that has occurred in 2 months, that the demand chains across the world have compressed into local markets, the global and local markets. And so here is a common prediction. Social distancing is forcing people to do more buying online, communicating through social media, and accelerating a permanent shift across the crisis to even more e-commerce and more virtual modeling, whether that be working from home or even the way upon which we communicate. As we started to connect across the boundaries, both physical and digital, it was an interesting set of conversations with many CEOs and CFOs and sales managers that gave us a really interesting perspective to say shorten the selling cycles in surviving and recovering from a crisis, increasing close rates, the efficiency of a sales model, and segment focus into strategic issues, not only for sales tasks. Consider this. When commerce resumes, what's the impact on the business, on shorter selling cycles, accelerated time to cash by 1 week or 2 weeks? How can we ensure that we can get faster, better, and more localized economies up to scale quick? Consistent messaging to customers, of course, is a very clear turn point for the recovery process. Companies need to sell to customers, not to trend or a priority, or to actually reprioritize what their resources are doing. Use data and don't hoard it. Important data is an account profitability to cost to serve your customer versus customer A and customer B. And for 1 or 2 reasons, of course, going back to basics, it's worth it. The coronavirus will eventually abate, and a few will remember the many false predictions during this crisis. But we will still have to live with business decisions. So how do we make the best decisions? And this is where it leads me on to, of course, the topic around every company and every government office needs a chief entrepreneur, because the best CEOs are excellent at growing and running a company with a known business model. What they don't do well is reinvent and innovate. It's not because they're incompetent, and it's not because they just fall short of the task. It's because they're committed to that business plan and that business model. Sure, look, there are exceptions. There are both visionary CEOs and innovators, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos as an example, but there are a few companies that can stomach that type of leadership. So if a CEO isn't someone who can innovate, then who should? And I believe that a CEO needs a partner for innovation inside their company, not outside. So too does government. Someone who'll create and defend a process, incentives and metrics, and will encourage these radical ideas and find a new area for growth. It's an executive who can help with large companies to reinvent themselves while they're still successful. And this new role sits right in the C-suite. You could call this person a chief entrepreneur. Now, it's not someone who answers to the CEO, it's someone who sits beside the CEO. Someone who can lead the future of the company while the CEO takes care of running the existing business. It's a huge divergence from the traditional norm of a chief role, but the chief entrepreneur is necessary. It's a position of influence and a position of action to ensure that the company innovates. But how do you hire for this role? Who do you look for? What qualifications must the candidate have? And are you a chief entrepreneur? Now more than ever, businesses need a chief entrepreneur who will build the future. The chief entrepreneur will be responsible for managing a portfolio of entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs. We have them in government, in the Innovation Champions Network. We also have entrepreneurs, those like me that run our own businesses out in the wild. These are people who experiment with new business models and value propositions. And someone who takes on this role is absolutely passionate for calculated risks. That's one of their secret sources. It's not a CTO or Chief Technical Officer, and nor is it a CIO, an Innovation Officer. It should be an executive that is almost as powerful as the CEO, with a clear leadership over radical innovation within a company or radical innovation with inside government and policy. So here's a list. What is it about the chief entrepreneur? Passionate about building business, producing growth engines with calculated bets, not wild ass gambles. These are calculated bets. Believe that most things are possible and you persevere through the downturns. There's charm, charisma, enthusiasm, hard work, of course, marketing to encourage and drive teams to think that your idea or any idea is possible. Now, if you've built a number of businesses in the past or you've built up $100 million company, of course, that is a good track record. But you're especially valuable if you've been able to meet large targeted change in large corporations with complex structures. Now, you've got to be comfortable with uncertainty. Don't fear failure. And you see failure as an opportunity to learn and to iterate towards a solution. Be tremendously diplomatic and address conflict head on with one focus in mind: secure the money, whether that's run to revenue, whether that is with capital injection, but it's about resources. Bring on the money and the resources needed to test, innovate, and ideate your ideas. Now, the responsibilities of a chief entrepreneur actually builds the future of the company. And I can't stress this enough. The chief entrepreneur is responsible for developing new business models, new policy, even value proposition for the company's future growth. Guide and support the team of entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, as I've said before. Design and construct a space for innovation. Now, this isn't just about beanbags and coffee in the morning. This is a digital space. These are safe contractual spaces. Those safe contractual spaces to allow those and partnerships to be formed. You're responsible for creating the habitat upon which a team can experiment, learn, and fail. And this indigenous and additional culture is where ideas can be thoroughly tested. Defend the culture, process, incentives, and metrics that are born within this space, and introduce innovation accounting. Yes, we are accountable as innovators. Develop a new process that measures whether you're making progress in building the new business or generating new revenue or generating jobs. How you experiment in helping your teams learn, reduce uncertainty and risk also brings a level of accountability. And one of the keys is to nurture and establish great partnerships, whether that be with the CEO or with external corporates. Work together to ensure resources and assets are available to validate and invalidate your ideas. Be responsible for building partnerships to discuss and progress and share those new ideas, and communicate the key across the organization to help with financing those future experiments. Now, in today's corporate world, more than ever, we need to be ambidextrous organizations. And as I say, I'm a multi-hyphenate, one that has many skill sets that can come together in the same mindset, but different skill sets. Companies that can execute and innovate at the same time. We need to be able to set up a hard to understand, but yet easy to execute role within the organization, which is the chief entrepreneur. Now, Steve Blank points out, who's a great writer, that every large company must face the reality of continuous innovation and disruption or risk becoming obsolete altogether. Now, look, there's no doubt that the chief entrepreneur is always going to experience conflict, particularly if we're rubbing against today's normal. But with a bit of patience and perseverance, a new role as the chief entrepreneur can be successfully integrated into any existing corporation. And potentially, we might very well see that the thought leadership of the future will be embedded and threaded horizontally with innovation. So across the organization, for those that are here, think and look in the mirror. Do you hold the traits of an innovation logic? Are you comfortable in uncertainty? Are you able to bring together really complex ways of thinking, but deliver them in a simplistic form? And don't pay attention to just only the existing paradigms of business, but also the traits of the people, the skills logic that exists inside of teams, and give people a chance to lead with innovation, not just enabling innovation to be the fuel under an existing business model. And who knows, that person might even be you.
Thanks so much, Leanne. That was fantastic.
I think we got lots of questions on the channel.
Yeah, we've got a few. I wanted to kick off. First of all, I just wanted to check where you're at. Are you in? Where are you? It looks like a beautiful day.
This is not one of those fancy Zoom backdrops, actually. I'm in regional Queensland, of course, right out, literally, in the paddocks.
Wow.
And funnily enough, I'm glad the dog didn't bark because I've got one right here. So that would have been awkward.
I love it. So, Leanne, I was just interested. I think it's a wonderful idea, but I wondered, how would you convince the, I think one of the questions here is, how would you convince the CEO or the board of putting or investing in this role?
I guess the time for that conversation is now. It's very clear that many existing businesses are being completely disrupted. And to assume that customers will return to the same purchasing habits, to assume that the economy will come back into the exact same state, that Z-axis I spoke about before, is actually the right timing to have this conversation now. Pretty much most business models are being rethought, or had to be and has to be rethought. Even the way upon which we use our resources needs to be rethought. Whilst at the same time, we have to carefully do what we call a cantering pirouette. And I don't know if anyone's an equestrian on the line, but if you're in a cantering pirouette, it means that the horse needs to actually move its back feet in one direction, its front feet in another direction, whilst the rider must sit perfectly and safely in the middle of the horse. And that's what we're asking businesses and CEOs to do right now. So it is right time to have that conversation today, because huge disruption is upon us at a time where actually nearly every single organization is needing to be rethought. There was a piece that I wrote quite some time ago as a newsletter with the Chief Entrepreneur's Office, and it was really about calling out the difference between managerial logic, or the current way upon which hierarchical structures work in organizations, and innovation logic. And it really shows and quite easily gives you the depiction between the two. So for those that are wanting to have conversations with CEOs, point to that article, and I think you can share it on the channel, we'll find it. And it will be able to bring up and help with that conversation about how this is slightly different, but certainly not completely disruptive. It's co-evolving the business model. It's co-evolving the organization to the next level to cope with these types of challenges.
Leanne, there's people on the line that probably don't know your background in providing an amazing solution worldwide to the diamond industry. I mean, that company itself is revolutionary. I mean, do you want to just touch on how you've managed to bring trust, and why was that important to you to bring trust to that supply chain?
Well, there were very real problems to be solved in a 500-year-old industry that effectively stood its test of time. But when we think about types of challenges that exist in the world, most of it are in opaque markets. So bringing transparency at a time where the rising of these technologies were coming together was the right time for Everledger to be born, and that was 2015. So we built a platform of provenance. Provenance didn't exist. It was just a word that was once used in the art world. You know, for those that spent a lot of time in France or in the old masters of the art world, you would have heard provenance, but it wasn't really heard outside of that market. So we built a platform of provenance and decided to point that to the most opaque, probably most conflicted supply chain in the world, and that's the diamond industry. So we track diamonds from the source of the mine right the way through to the retail network. We're able to tell the story of the diamond with some scientific certainty to the consumer, and they can make a full consciousness of mind decision about that purchase. And we've seen a lot of these types of endeavours come to the market, and some of them, of course, have been greenwashing around sustainability, making sure that, you know, there's a nice Planet Earth sticker on the side of a label. But we didn't really have all of the technologies together to bring that data-led environment to the forefront. So we think our technology can stretch out well beyond diamonds. done the work in coloured gemstones in places like Tanzania and through the other African countries, but also out into the fashions and luxury goods sector. And when I think about what could be the most potentially conflicted supply chain in the world by 2030, 2050, and it's batteries, it's stored energy. When I think about that supply chain, it's lithium and it's cobalt from the Congo DRC. And where does it go to after it leaves me? That's a big economic transition that we'll all be thinking about, like waste to value, circular economy. If you're not thinking and reading about this, click on it, go find it, because it will become a part of an economic transition strategy. We already have a federal minister in China for circular economy. They closed the borders to waste. So this is not just a fairy dream. This is actually something that isn't even in a crystal ball. This is just about time catching up to the realities of the moment.
It interested me. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit. I know you've been doing so much during this period. The whole idea of the global market. I mean, how do you see that panning out?
So what I think is really interesting about today is we often have seen supply chains being highly secured, and most of that has been driven by defence, right? So we defend our borders and we're sure that we have the right number of, bullets, helicopters and or frigates to protect our nation's borders. But what COVID rose very quickly were supply chains that require sovereignty. That's food, and luckily Australia, we're the food belt, so we can feed 7 times our population here. But once we were at risk with medical supplies, most of that, shockingly enough, was held by only a few companies in the world, particularly around their patent design, and people were dying. So we're starting to think more now from a potential of not just supply chains, but supply chains to value chains. So hence the waste to value conversation, but also risk chains. Now, not all of those will sit under the heavy governance of defence, but we will build new economies based on these sovereignty supply chains that mean the quality of our life, regardless of what's happening in a global pandemic, or albeit even like a world war, we're going to be protected. We can bring together the quality of our life through this time. And Australia and New Zealand, and I'll couple us together, when comparing what we have done and how we have coped with that, it far outstrips any other country in the world. But it also has given us rethinking about remanufacturing, reshoring. How do we actually get rights to some of these big global companies that have mass distribution but can't serve the last mile? And even if you have free trade agreements in place through this time, we saw the EU that came together as a collective nation all of a sudden fall apart and said, no, I'm not going to give you, I'm closing my borders. So what does it really mean in the times of most need? Are those partnerships truly strengthened? So it leans us back to say, wow, we need to be really sure about our global market. Global, have a vision for what is needed globally, but also ensure that we have local, which is a great time for us to be able to spin up entirely new opportunities, particularly for regional Queensland.
Leanne, now I know you, and I know that you're a bit of an optimist, but with all of this uncertainty, I mean, how someone actually mentioned in the chat about how to feel comfortable with uncertainty and with this new future, and you're sort of saying the role of the chief entrepreneur would be one that would be looking to building a future for companies. I mean, what are your tips about how people should feel more comfortable, embracing the future or so?
So this is my point, like entrepreneurs don't seek titles of chiefs because we are what we do. It's as simple as that. So when I think about the jobs of the future, I don't really concern myself for jobs of the future because I spend my time in a constant commitment to lifelong learnings. I thrive in uncertainty because I don't see it as risk, I see it as opportunity. And I've built a life on becoming a multi-hyphenate, being able to put my hands to many things, but to be focused on the challenge or the problem to be solved, but to be resilient enough through that challenge to build out this anti-fragility, which means it's not just being able to withstand a challenge in front of me, but it's to build the strength of knowledge through this time, which is anti-fragility, this muscle strength. So entrepreneurs are going to do it anyway, and we are doing it. If you pick up if there was such a thing for the yellow pages of entrepreneurship, I guarantee if you sit down and have a coffee, there wouldn't be many that are even worried through this time of COVID, because there are different ways to be able to reform and form business models, which is really parts of the essence of the thinking of an entrepreneur. That's often seen to be disruptive in the eyes of corporates. So what I'm saying is, actually, if there was to become a formalized role, instead of just having this one crazy person, this maverick within the organization, why don't you give them a formalized mandate? Give them the resources to enable them to survive and thrive, make them a true partner of the CEO and the board. And I'm quite sure you'll see that that will actually help to provide for the next stage of certainty.
I like that idea. And I think there's a lot of people on the Zoom call that are actually really enjoying that idea. I think it's sort of mind stretching too, to think that they would be aligned or, aside the chief executive officer. I suppose I wonder about a cultural shift though. I mean, it's not just enough to put someone at the top. I mean, how would you imagine that the culture needs to change in an organization for that person to feel welcome and to be part of this new way of working?
So if you are a great entrepreneur or a great founder, you are both an introvert and an extrovert, and you're balanced between the two. Dave Hayes just said I was talking way too quick. Sorry, Dave. I'm on a time clock, mate. They've got the pressure on me. So I think the cultural shift is something that is really important, but hence that is a part of the issue with organizations. We think about Kodak. The Kodak moment that came so quickly to them was actually very well seen, well ahead of time. So the cultural shift within all organizations needs to change, because not everything that was guaranteed yesterday will be delivered into tomorrow. So I'm calling out that actually all values and all culture within organizations, particularly corporates, need to change. Let's start thinking about how you can team and reteam in a way upon which that people use the best of their skills rather than the title on their cards. Now, that's a very different way to think about hierarchical order too. Companies have done it. They're billion-dollar businesses. They're called Spotify. They're called Google. They're called Facebook. So these are large organizations. This isn't just a novel thought of a bunch of crazy people saying, do it in a different way. These are billion-dollar companies that have been built and continuously built based on that culture being driven from day one, the global view from day one, the distributed teaming from day one. And you'll see massive organizations coming out of the COVID time. Parts of probably some of the existing infrastructure businesses will fail rapidly. And at the same time, we will see huge escalation coming from some of these companies that are actually structured in a way of flexibility. Most corporations aren't structured in flexibility.
No, and it's funny because this week, as I mentioned earlier today, the first time on mute, but the second time, hopefully people actually heard me. This was meant to be the week we had Agile Australia, which of course is all about better ways of working. So I know for a lot of people attending the summit this week, your thoughts will be very welcome. I suppose that whole notion of using the best of your skills. I mean, you've been running first your own organization and since then inspiring a whole state around, entrepreneurship. I mean, what is your advice about how people empower others to use the best of their skills, especially in times like these?
I would say that it's one of the blessings that's come out of COVID is micro-credentials. We think about how universities had to pivot so rapidly into a digital form, how the government stood very quickly behind micro-credentialing, whether that be in cybersecurity or even upskilling business logic innovation. And I think that these micro-credentialings helps us nudge towards that learning agenda rather than committing to this daunting 4-year commitment to university. So I think embedded within culture should be this ever learning process that should actually come about. Again, it's a cultural commitment, but the mechanisms are here now. We have that digital learning platforms in place across universities and TAFEs, and we have micro-credentialing in place as well. What we should also be thinking about doing is overlaying our education series, whether that be in micro-credentialing or with TAFEs and universities, and looking at that hype curve of technology. So could welders become augmented welders? Like, is there going to be a place in the world here in Queensland where the marrying of welding will come together with those augmented glasses? So instead of using paper in drafting and welding sticks to actually put it together, could that actually be a combined skill set? And it's a trick question, because the answer is yes. We already have companies across Queensland doing that. But what we're not seeing is that transition well threaded. So ask CEOs, how many CEOs go through micro-credentialing themselves? So if you're not able to have that culturally embedded within the values of the C-level suite within the organization, then of course that's not going to permeate through the entire company. And hence it goes back to that values change and that cultural change. But we're already in a good place. We're starting to get those micro-credentials in place. We're looking at fast tracking. We've got Udacity, of course, which is a huge online university globally. Harvard is now delivering incredible digital content across the world. So it's not just limited to our universities in Queensland. We can also reach back out into global universities for this type of knowledge as well.
Leanne, I just wanted to ask a question around where you think trust is, and because you're such an expert on supply chains in this world, which is changing. I mean, you mentioned in Queensland quite a bit, so supply chains within Australia, but also globally, and how much is trust going to be a thing going forward for the future?
I think there's a big shift towards human-centric brands. And within human-centric brands, as humans, we seek trust. And of course, we haven't necessarily had the technologies available to deliver that trust in a way that surpasses, you know, a gentleman's handshake or having face-to-face communication. And we will get better at that globally. But this human centrality, and I think it's coming out even more amplified than ever before, particularly given COVID, because we looked at humanity, or humanity looked at us straight in the eyes, is what can we trust? How can we trust it? And at what point in time can we actually do that in a digital world, in a safe environment? There'll be more emphasis on that, more so than ever, but we will have a time, particularly over the next 2 to 5 years, where there will be more focus on that sovereignty, so on that nationalized supply chains. So there's a balance. How do we as a state, or how do we as a nation, then still supply the very best of the goods and services that are needed? And we can't compete on costs, because it's just impossible to compete on a cost base against China. So is there a different way upon which we can compete with just trust? Because we do have a clean, green, healthy, no child labour environment here in Australia. So how do we deliver that in a far better way? And secondly, how are we to ensure that the prosperity is kept through a low cost base? So can we compete on durability? So it's trust, durability, as well as this human centricity towards brand. Because I think we're moving, as it was so eloquently said last week by another entrepreneur, that if she had her time over again, she'd be thinking about what is contribution over consumption. So what contribution can we make collectively over just being a consumer? And we're starting to see some of those things tip.
Well, I like that. I think that is a fantastic thought on which to end this. Leanne, I can't thank you enough. It's just been inspiring. It's been wonderful to hear from you, and we can hear the wind and see the blue sky in Queensland. So within a couple of weeks, we'll all be back up north, I think, for some sunshine.
It's great. Yeah, I'm on the road now. Chief Entrepreneur's Office on the road every Monday, and in the mid-July, we're hitting the regions for 6 solid weeks. The electric scooter won't make it to Cairns, but a good camper van will. So off we go.
Oh my goodness, that's fantastic. I love it. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm hoping we might be able to entice you to Agile Australia, if not this year, in future years, because I think so much of what you're saying is why responsible tech fits so well with Agile Australia, because it is about, you know, for us, it's about how to build things more thoughtfully, but what you've been talking about, it's also about a whole new way of thinking of the world and of thinking of the organisations. So thank you for giving us so much food for thought this morning, and we'll
My
see
pleasure.
you soon. Have a safe travels. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those
And
brave CEOs on the line, go get yourself a chief entrepreneur.